Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the International Center Goa's program, Kitab, Books and Discussion. We have with us Abhishek Choudhary, who is writing a biography of the former Prime Minister, Shri Atal Behari Vajpayee. Abhishek has been spending some time with us, the past month in fact, as a scholar in residence at the International Center Goa's new initiative, which is for writers who are in the final stages of completing their book or have at least made some progress towards writing their book. Abhishek is trained as an economist, but switched to journalism after working for a while. And he took on this very ambitious project of writing a very, very detailed, comprehensive biography of one of India's favorite prime ministers over the last 3 decades, perhaps since independence. And the work has been ongoing for about 5 years. He's finally finishing off the book, hopefully sometime in the next coming months. We'll be talking to Abhishek about the process, what persuaded him to take on such an ambitious task, the time that has gone by in devoted to researching this book and writing it, and about his next project. But mostly we'll be discussing about what his book is about on the former Prime Minister Atal Behari ji, as he's known as. So let's begin, and you can also ask your questions. We'll be taking questions sometime in between as well as throughout the program, and so that there is more involvement on the part of all those who have joined us, about 15-20 of you so far. Abhishek, let's begin with a very, very obvious kind of question. And I mentioned that in my introduction, which is, you were trained as an economist, you were working as a journalist, and as a relatively young man who is now a bit older, what on earth made you decide that this was a project that you were going to take up, that you decided to work on? And at that time, did you think that it would take such a long time? Is it something that there was always more to know, there was always more to discover, find in archives in Delhi and around the country and also abroad? You mentioned in your description that, or I think we discussed it earlier, that you had to actually get a lot of material from London and from the United States as well. So what made you take the plunge? And after you took the plunge, what made you stay on track?
Thank you, Dr. Pushkar, for that generous introduction. Am I audible to you?
Yes, very much.
Okay, great. So, well, like many projects, it began with a mix of curiosity and some opportunism. Opportunism because at that point, and I'm talking of early 2015, at that point did not exist even a hagiography on Mr. Vajpayee. And I thought, no hagiography, not even an opportunistic quickie. And I thought, how come there can be no decent book on such a colossal, a monumental political character? So some of this was opportunism, certainly, but I think a greater chunk of it was curiosity. Like I always thought of Vajpayee as a man who was very, very glamorized, but at the same time, he was also very, very enigmatic. The sheer longevity, think of the sheer longevity of his political career. Like he's almost like the Amitabh Bachchan of Indian politics. He's a 12-term MP. We do not even understand what that means. That record is nearly impossible to break for anyone in the recent future. And yet, I realized that when I started going to Teen Murti, at the end of very first month, I realized that we know so very little about the first 50 years of his life. And so, every day that I spent in the archive was useful, and I got to know at least one new thing every day. And some of those things, I realized that almost nobody knows about most of those things. Like I remember one of the first discoveries that I made in the archive at Teen Murti was that Vajpayee's father died away exactly the week after he fought his first election and lost it from Lucknow in 1955. And I thought that was, in some ways, that was, again, a very interesting and a moving piece of information that I had never heard before. And, 1955 was a very crucial year in his life. That was the time he fought his first election from Lucknow, but also a very tragical a tragic moment in his personal life because he lost both his parents. They were diagnosed, his father was diagnosed of gastric cancer and his mother was diagnosed of mouth cancer. And at that time, people did not even know what mouth cancer was. So, and these small nuggets, and every day that I spent in an archive, I got these nuggets. And through archival work and through personal interviews, every day I was getting to know new things that nobody knew. And by the end of 2016, I knew that I had to do this book, even if it took time. Yes, I did not know that it will take me 5 years. But then, you know what? The process of life writing is such that the more there's never a time to finish a project. I remember there are times when I interviewed some of Mr. Vajpayee's relatives. The first few times, they gave me quotable quotes. But it was only after I talked to them, I went to them for the 5th time, that they told me something that was actually psychologically very, very revealing. So I realized that, had I been a journalist, I would have merely gone and interviewed them once. I got the quote and wrote my piece. But the point of a biography is, psychological insight. And in an interview, you only sometimes get when somebody begins to really, really trust you. So all these nuances I understood. And also, more than personal interviews or archival research, as I was discussing with you in the morning, for the first time, the project also forced me to think deeply about my own politics. Because, writing a biography invariably requires you to pronounce judgments or verdicts on your subject's career or moral character. But for that, a biographer also ought to have a reference, a moral fulcrum of his or her own. And I'm not sure when I started out whether or not I had one. And I grappled with it for a very, very long time. And it was while I was researching this book that it suddenly occurred to me. And it came not from biographers, but it came while reading Ambedkar and Naipaul. So Ambedkar and Naipaul, coming from very different worlds, they came to one common conclusion, and which was that the root of India's crisis is social. It's not political, and it's certainly not economic. And neither of them have ever written a biography. So it gave me a perspective while I was researching the rise of Hindu nationalism in the 30s and 40s. It gave me a perspective because, if anybody who researches Hindu nationalism in the early decades of 20th century, there's always that pendulum that keeps swinging between two very urgent needs. One is Sanghathan, that is unity of all Hindus, and the other is social reforms. And I see that most Hindu nationalist movement always, every time there was a choice, they evaded the choice of social reforms. They always went for unity. And in some ways, I think social reforms has mostly been tokenism, which is why you see, even now in 2022, you see a lot of politicians across parties going to Dalit houses for lunch and dinner, and they think it's pretty cool to post these things on Twitter. So that gave me a perspective. Sorry, I think I'm losing track.
It's completely okay. It's completely okay. I mean,
So what I'm trying to say is a framework is very important. A biographer needs to have a framework of his or her own. A biographer needs to have a moral center of his or her own in order to write a biography. And it took me time to have that.
No, apart from everything else, Abhishek, what struck me is that, this is your first book. This will be your first book. So I find it quite remarkable that, for someone writing their first book, to undertake such a journey and such a long journey, because it's not one of those books which you told yourself, look, I'm going to wrap it up in a year. I have some background in the social sciences. Vajpayee is a big figure in Indian politics, and let me get this book out. Let me be done with it. What I like about your answer so far, about what you have been saying so far, is that the deeper you got into it, you found there was more, and you went further and further. And writing about somebody whom you call, the Amitabh Bachchan of Indian politics, not necessarily that should be a label which should,
Right. I just casual example.
Yeah. But the point is also this, writing a biography. I mean, I'm going to ask you a little bit about what kind of whose biographies have you admired, or you thought, if only I could write a book on Atalji, which is of this quality, of this breadth and this scope. But I have a prior question, which is, all of us, when we undertake any book project or any writing, we are all grounded in, or we come from different vantage points. I mean, just thinking of two biographies on Atalji in the last couple of years. We had the late Shakti Sinha come to the International Center Goa with his biography. And more recently, Sagarika Ghosh has published her biography of Vajpayee. Now, one biography is by somebody who worked closely with the Prime Minister, with our former Prime Minister, comes from a more center-right, perspective. Very clearly. And you have the second biography of Mr. Vajpayee, which was published recently, comes more from a liberal left perspective. What I'm getting at is that one's own views about, in this case, what India is, what India should be, is going to influence in some way. I mean, however hard one tries to be objective about it, how you approach the subject. So when you say the framework, does the ideological framework from where you come, do you think, have you consciously made a decision that I'm going to keep myself, bias free? I mean, even then it might be difficult to remain completely bias free, but how do you approach this very sensitive idea of, being objective? Is it possible?
Well, quite frankly, I do not waste much time thinking about objectivity. I am a highly biased person and I like to be biased. But what I try to do is I try to spend a lot of time approaching a problem from all sides and then synthesize and come up with a coherent narrative. So that's what I do. And as I see it, for me, one cardinal rule of life writing is that a biography is a detached, it's an unsentimental assessment of somebody's life. A biography is not a tribute. This is something I'm very clear about. There is a time and place for tribute. But biography is not a place for tribute. Biography is a place for assessment. And all practitioners of the craft should know that. And I always think of it in terms of a carpet. Think of the craft of biography think of it as a beautiful Kashmiri carpet. A biographer's job is not to marvel at the beauty of the carpet. A biographer's job is to flip the carpet and then explain the intricate tapestry. I mean, you can admire the beauty for a while, but your main job is to explain the intricate tapestry. And I think this is a fundamental difference that a lot of people do not understand. A lot of people spend a lot of time praising or attacking. So a biography is neither a hatchet job nor a hagiography. And I don't know if that answers your question. Having said that, there will always be some bias, but people can work on it. I mean, I don't know if you read S. Gopal's book on his father, Sarupalli Radhakrishnan, and the kind of, so people can also go the completely other way. And then, for me, one book that really helped me was Patrick Friend's biography of V.S. Naipaul. It's called The World is What It Is. That book drilled into my head the idea that, it is possible to write 500 pages or 700 pages about somebody you love or respect in a detached, unsentimental way, even a scathing way if necessary. So yeah, that's the rule I follow.
Thanks, Abhishek.
And I promise you that, I'll promise everyone that if I ever write about my family, I'll subject them to the same degree of scrutiny that I have done to Mr. Vajpayee. So it's also, a matter of temperament, I suppose.
Okay.
Thank you. By temperament, I am not.
Okay. Let me get into the book. It's not I haven't read the book. I mean, this is for everyone. The book is work in progress. I have read a few chapters on and off, and Abhishek has been hard at work the past month trying to finalize the different chapters. He's been working on 2 parts. The book is in 7 parts. He's been trying to finalize 2 parts at least, and have his editors look at it. But one of the questions from the book, which would be of interest to everyone, is our generation, I mean, people who are in our generation in a very broad sense, people who from the 30s to the 60s, for most of us, Atalji, Mr. Vajpayee is somebody who arrives on the scene. And we remember him from the 70s, we know him from the 70s, but it's really the 80s and the 90s, which is pretty much the focus of, BJP and Mr. Vajpayee, Mr. Advani, and everyone else. What can you tell us? What did you find out about Mr. Vajpayee in his early days? We are talking about the late 40s, 50s, and the 60s, when he really made a name for himself as an accomplished politician, as a great orator, as somebody who could bring, the expression doing business with, people. I mean, you have to, in the parliament, in a democratic system, you have to be able to do business. There's a lot of give and take involved. And Vajpayee ji excelled at that, right? I mean, he did a very good job at that. He had friends from across the aisle, people with whom he disagreed, but still, could get along with. So what can you tell us about, in a nutshell, really, about the rise of the young Vajpayee as an accomplished parliamentarian and a respected politician?
Okay, I'll begin. Let me begin with where he came from. So Vajpayee spent a childhood deeply steeped in Arya Samaj. And later, when he was at his 15, he was introduced to RSS. And he grew up in the Gwalior of late 30s and early 40s, where the Gwalior city had become kind of a mini Hindutva republic. So it was a very charged, very polarized environment. So Gwalior had become very pro-Hindu, and the adjacent Bhopal state had become very pro-Muslim League. So these things were happening. And after that, he was in Gwalior for his college, and after that he went to Kanpur for his MA. And after his MA, he shifted to Lucknow, and there he joined RSS full-time. And this was in August 1947, exactly the month India got independence. And he started editing. RSS was basically at that point trying to spread in North India. Nobody knew it in North India. And one of the ways was to start journals, or more accurately, mouthpieces. And Mr. Vajpayee was young and bright, and did not have to be paid. So he became one of the founding members of. He launched many magazines in quick succession. He launched Rashdhar, he launched Panchjanya, he launched Sandesh, some of which, by the way, still continue to be in print. But at this point, his chief motivation in life was to do a PhD, and he was hoping to combine a day job with a PhD. And he thought, he would either join academia at some point, or work at the cross of academia and journalism. Politics was nowhere on his mind. But events overtook him. First one was Gandhi's murder, and his press was seized. RSS was banned because of whatever reasons, and he went underground. He was one of the few people in all of UP who successfully evaded getting arrested. And for all those more than a year, the span of 14-15 months, he evaded arrest on some occasions. Barely, he managed to escape on some occasions, and he carried out underground work, and that's how he became quite popular within RSS circles. And soon after the RSS was unbanned, his celebrity rose. That was the first time everybody in RSS got to know him, and he began to be. He was sent at all RSS programs as a star speaker, and that was his first shot at celebrityhood. Then, of course, Sama Prasad Mukherjee, who had resigned Hindu Mahasabha and was trying to launch a new party. They took RSS's help. And Mr. Vajpayee, he accompanied Sama Prasad Mukherjee ji during 1951 election tours, and was quite impressed by his ability to convey very complex ideas in very good Hindi and a very ordinary Hindi that people understood. Whereas Sama Prasad Mukherjee was a great speaker in English, he was a great speaker in Bengali, but he mumbled and fumbled while speaking Hindi. And so he was quite impressed by Vajpayee, and so he took him under his wings, and that's how Mr. Vajpayee came to Delhi in 53. And it was after his death that he joined Jan Sangh full-time. I mean, that's one of the myths. His CV also mentions that he was a founding member of Jan Sangh. That's not entirely accurate, because Jan Sangh was founded in 51. He was then an editor. Mr. Vajpayee joined the party as a working committee member only towards the end of 1953. And then, well, he was a bright young man, and he had a swift promotion. In 1955, he was made to fight his first election. It was a by-election from Lucknow. And nobody thought he would make a dent, but he won 28% seats, and it surprised pretty much everyone how he did that. And then one thing led to another, and you can understand RSS's desperation to send Vajpayee to parliament, that in 1957, they made him fight from 3 seats. Like, I have never seen that before. I have tried to research if anyone else has ever fought from 3 seats. 2 seats are common, but no one else. And, he managed to win a seat. And that's how, he reached parliament. And still, and during that period, 1953 to 1957, he traveled very widely across the country. Like, he was in UP and Bihar during co-protection movement. He was in J&K to oppose Article 370. He was also a part of Goa Satyagraha. He was part of the Jansangh people who opposed linguistic states. So he was traveling all across, becoming part of all kinds of movements and getting a lot of exposure. And that's how, then he reached Delhi finally in 1957. And but he was, for a while, he was still known only inside the RSS circles. His shot to fame across the country came in 1959 when he forced Nehru to issue a white paper detailing, India's border dispute with China. And that was very surprising because nobody, not even MPs and cabinet ministers, knew that, China had captured hundreds of square miles of India's land. And that's how he, became a very national celebrity of sorts. Because in those days, Parliament had very few opposition members, and even fewer opposition members who spoke well. And Vajpayee was one of those people who actually he took on Nehru at every chance he got to take him down. So Nehru used to be very irritated with Vajpayee in the early years. So that's the journey from joining RSS in 47 to becoming a star in the late 50s.
And this will be this is an important chunk of your book. The first part of your book explores all this, covers this period in some detail, right?
Oh yes. Actually, I write about these things in more than 100 pages. So the USP of my book is actually the early life, the first half of life, because we know so very little about Vajpayee's early life, like till the time he became the Janata Foreign Minister. We know so very little. The cliche is, the cliche, including people in my family, also believe that that Advani made BJP popular because in 84 they had only 2 seats, in 89 they got 89, they got 90 seats, and then they wrote the Ayodhya movement and came to power. But what people do not realize, no, that is not cherry picking. That is just picking up 2 data points. If you look at the trend, you would see that Hindu right had support even in the 60s. That's how they won. In the year 1968, they had around 50 MPs in parliament, 35 in Lok Sabha and 15 in Rajya Sabha, and around 300 MLAs. Now think of it, that's a very sizable number. And during the Janata government, the Jansangh faction of Janata government got 90 seats. So these are very sizable numbers. So we keep ignoring that Jansangh also had a presence in the early days, and we still know very little about it. So part of my endeavor was to explain the first half of Mr. Vajpayee's career.
Are there any biographies of Mr. Vajpayee from which were written in the 70s or 80s? Because by then he was nothing. Okay, so that basically means that it's only after he becomes India's prime minister and after that he became the subject of greater attention. Because without being a prime minister, without being or he was the foreign minister in the 70s, that did not attract sufficient attention, I guess.
At that time it did, but yes, at that time it did.
Okay. Not enough for people to write a biography of him. There's something else which we talked about. You have been here for about a month and we have been talking on and off about different things. Is that in the 90s, and this is again about Mr. Vajpayee as representing as the leader of the BJP. In the 90s, was there clarity that he was the number one, that he was the leader of choice of the BJP? Because there was some sort of a competition too between Mr. Advani, LK Advani and Mr. Vajpayee. And, you mentioned that it is through the 90s, early 90s, while Mr. Advani made a name for himself through the Rath Yatra and other ways, Mr. Vajpayee also, basically worked at, making himself more prominent, more visible, and so on. Could you tell us a little bit in detail about that period, the early 90s?
Yes. Well, through a series of events after the Babri demolition, Vajpayee's profile shot up, whereas Advani's diminished. And after being in wilderness for a few years, 90s were a good time for Mr. Vajpayee, post Babri 90s. Everything he touched was turning gold. And so, first of all, he made his name as a troubleshooter. What, soon after the Babri demolition, I don't know if you remember, Sangh Parivaar was banned, RSS was banned, VHP was banned, Bajrang Dal was banned. All of BJP's top leadership, they were arrested. And there was a proposal also to ban the BJP. And even though Mr. Vajpayee was sulking in private, whatever, he had very ambiguous take on Ayodhya, he later that month, in the second last week of December 1992, he moved a no confidence motion in parliament to protest the bans and arrests and defended his party vociferously. And, for the first time, he argued that, outlawing ideological adversaries is not an answer. So far, everybody in BJP had been saying that, Ayodhya is not a political issue for us, it's a cultural issue. But for the first time, of all places in parliament, Mr. Vajpayee said that, Ayodhya is for us a political thing. It's not a cultural, merely a cultural thing. So that was revealing for, in some ways he was contradicting his own claims. But the main point that I'm trying to make is he was a very good troubleshooter. And he proved himself to be a very, very successful troubleshooter. In 95, there was, he managed to, like Gujarat unit of BJP was faction ridden. On one hand, there was Keshubhai Patel and Narendra Modi. On the other hand, there was Shankar Singh Waghela. And Shankar Singh Waghela was, he felt neglected, and he had a faction of around 40, 50 MLAs. And he was trying to, become chief minister with Congress's support. And Mr. Advani landed up in Gandhinagar, and then he sacked him from the party. And, because that did not solve the problem, that worsened the problem. So that was, in these moments, Advani's talents left him. So then Mr. Vajpayee was dispatched, and what he did was he tried to cajole him. And, I interviewed people in Gujarat, and they say, Mr. Vajpayee was very good at blackmailing. And he'd be like, hum log ka jeevan janam ka saath raha hai, aur aap tum kaise chhod ke ja sakte. He gave a pep talk to Waghela. And he actually quelled Waghela's revolt. Very cleverly, he did not give Waghela the chief ministerial seat. He gave it to a compromise candidate. But for the time being, he managed to avert a vertical split. And this was, again, a big thing in those days. So he was a very successful troubleshooter. He acquired the image of a moderate guy who gets things done when they're really required. Whereas Advani, he kind of lost his shield. And then Vajpayee was also friends with Narasimha Rao. And Narasimha Rao used to use him to troubleshoot on some important occasion. In early 94, everybody now knows it, that Narasimha Rao sent him to defend India's stand in Geneva on human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir. And he came back successfully. So with all these things, his profile shot up. Yes, he also connived at it. Had he wanted to retire, he could have chosen to retire, but he did not retire. He made really subtle attempts to boost up his profile. And as I was telling you the other day, he had never published his poetry. But for the first time, he came out with multiple poetry collections. For the first time, he published a collection of his speeches, which was called 4 Decades in Parliament, even though it had only been 35 years. So, these are very subtle hints of ambition. And then, there came a time when his detractors were obliged, they were compelled to give him his due. He had, in his head, he has always been the leader of Janasangh since 1957. So he was relieved to be told that, okay, you will be leading the party. And in any case, that was a good decision, because if you remember, in early 96, Advani got charge sheeted in Hawala. And then he took a moral posturing. He retired. He resigned from Lok Sabha immediately, and he said, I won't fight an election unless I'm absolved. So that was a good decision. And yes, it's true that if it was not Vajpayee, the allies would not have come on board. George Fernandes might not have come on board with Advani. So these factors were there. But, more than, as true as all of these factors, is also a deep psychological compulsion in Advani's head, which was that, Vajpayee had been his mentor most of his life. And for the brief period, except for the brief period of 89 to 92, Vajpayee had always been his boss. And when Vajpayee had not been his boss, things had gone wrong. And so he thought, let him be my boss, and let him lead the party as long as he wants to, and then I'll have my share.
Abhishek, is it correct to say, this is something that a bunch of people, journalists, political scientists have written about, making that somewhat easy distinction. And I think the reality would be more complex, where Vajpayee was seen as representing the moderate faction within the BJP, whereas Mr. Advani was seen as representing the hardline faction. Is there some truth to it, or is it something which all political parties, I mean, not just BJP, but ideological parties, I mean, left-wing parties, right-wing parties of all kinds, you find the presence of factions? I mean, you have different kinds of factions. What my question is simply this: did Vajpayee and Advani represent moderate and hardline factions respectively within the BJP, or was it more of in terms of how they presented themselves to the public? I mean, it's very hard to know. I mean, in that sense, I mean, political actions, I mean, what politicians do in the public sphere is very often quite different from what they believe in. What they do in the public sphere is to promote themselves or the political party, right? So what are your views on that? What did you find out from your research?
Well, they had different temperaments, yes, but I would not go to say that one was a hardliner, one was a softliner. I mean, if you remember, Mr. Vajpayee always fell in line towards the end. He was not part of the Ayodhya movement, and yet he defended BJP. In fact, he also landed up in Lucknow, which was his parliamentary constituency, on the evening of 5th of December, and made a slightly controversial speech. I mean, he could have chosen to stay away, but I think his calculation was that if BJP stands to gain from the Babri demolition, as they were widely expected to. I mean, if you remember, BJP has benefited a lot from Advani's Rath Yatra of 1990. They did very well in the 91 elections. And there was a calculation that BJP might benefit from it. So Vajpayee's own calculation may have been that, if BJP benefits, I should not be left behind. So in that sense, I would not go on to say that, he was a liberal or anything. Yes, I mean, he had some differences with the hardliner faction, but I would not go to say that they were two polar opposites. So it was more, a difference of style, I would say, a difference of style, difference of strategy, rather than, hardliner or softliner thing. Yeah. I would not call Vajpayee a liberal for sure.
Okay. For everyone who's joined us, the book should be available hopefully by the end of the year, and we'll try to get Abhishek again to Goa for a physical presentation, a book launch perhaps. But this is just as an aside. Getting back to biographies, do you get a sense that there has been a resurgence, sort of, in terms of writing, a lot of biographies? I mean, you have Vikram Sampath's 2 volumes. As I mentioned earlier, Sagarika Ghosh has a biography of Vajpayee. Before that, others. Are we in a period where writing biographies, whether well researched or not, is become popular? Is a thing now?
Well, I'm not entirely sure about that. I suspect it has more to do with the larger non-fiction boom. For sure, there are more biographies being written now than ever before, but I think it's part of the larger non-fiction boom. And also, I'm not very sure about the sales. Like Vikram Sampath's book is selling well, but most other biographies, I'm not sure if they are how well they are selling. So I'm not sure. I would not call it a resurgence of biographies. Yeah.
Okay. Little bit on Vajpayee's approach to economic liberalization and reforms. This has been a sensitive topic for the RSS as well. And Vajpayee is described by many as a reformer, you had economic reforms, liberalization from 1991. Some say started a bit earlier, 1980, 84 onwards, but it really picks up from 1991 onwards. Again, in a relative sense, we didn't quite open up as Argentina did, or as many countries in South America and elsewhere did. But again, placing Vajpayee as prime minister, was he a reformer? Was he somebody who felt that you didn't need to have an overbearing state, an extremely interventionist state, and that there was a greater role for the market? I mean, broadly along those lines, that the state didn't have to be everywhere. Pretty much in terms of what was the role of the state in the economy. I mean, this is something which has been, a big issue in India, whether the state should be more involved or less involved, and if involved in what sectors, and if less involved in what sectors. Do you think Vajpayee, is it fair to categorize Vajpayee as a reformer?
Okay.
Or as somebody who preferred the status quo in matters of the economy?
Well, you know what? First of all, I'll broaden it a little bit. One of the tragedies of India's economic reforms is that India has never had a politician who has a consistent stand on economic reforms. Not one politician. Like during Vajpayee's era, all the previous reformers, whether it was P.V. Narasimha Rao, whether it was Manmohan Singh, whether it was Chidambaram, they all became great leftists. Everybody was opposing labor reforms. No, that's absurd. Manmohan Singh opposing labor reforms is absurd. Chidambaram opposing disinvestment is absurd. Not the least because Chidambaram's government had set up the disinvestment commission. So that is a serious problem. And Mr. Vajpayee was not an exception. When he was in opposition, look, he had his dilemmas. In private, he still, he did some deal, he cut some deal with Congress, and he bailed out Narasimha Rao on some occasions. But in public, he always opposed them, to the extent that in early 1995, he outdid himself. He said, if our government comes to power, we will quit WTO. No, that was wholly absurd. And it came to bite him later. But yes, I mean, dilemmas, keeping the dilemmas aside, and, he was a reformer, both by conviction, but also by necessity. Because, after the nuclear test, one of the few ways of courting the US was to, they had imposed sanctions. And one of the few ways of wooing them was to open up your economy and talking to Pakistan, among other things. So, yeah, he was a reformer both by conviction and by necessity. Now, I'll explain the reforms during Vajpayee era. There were basically two kinds of reforms during Vajpayee era. One was the non-legislative reforms, the ones that did not require you to pass laws in Rajya Sabha. And most of what Vajpayee is now known for, the telecom revolution or the infrastructure boom, Golden Quadrilateral, North-South, East-West corridor, they are examples of non-legislative reforms in some ways. So there he succeeded more. But again, he did not quite succeed with disinvestment. He tried really hard, but eventually he gave up with disinvestment. Now coming to the more tangled thing about the legislative reforms. Now, this is very interesting. Vajpayee's tactic was he would conduct private negotiations with the Congress government, with the opposition government. By that, I mean Mrs. Gandhi and Dr. Manmohan Singh. And his tactic was that, if he succeeded in convincing Congress, which had the majority in Rajya Sabha, he would present his plan as fait accompli to his own people, to BJP, and by that I mean allies. Now, this is important because nobody wanted reforms. Opposition did not want reforms. Allies did not want reforms. Sangh Parivaar's bodies like Swadeshi Jagran Manch and BMS, the Mazdoor Sangh, did not want reforms. BJP, a majority of BJP MPs did not want reforms. In fact, a majority of cabinet members also did not want reforms. So it was very tough. It was a lonely battle conducting reforms. Even so, Congress, so what he would do is he would try to convince the Congress, and if they agreed, they would say, "Acha, chalo, ye log taiyar ho gaye, to matlab, how can we not, we have to pass it." And through that route, he managed to pass certain reforms. But then again, he could not pass labor reforms because, they were, the back-end negotiations were at a very advanced stage. But then Tehelka came in March 2001, and Mr. Vajpayee had picked that session, budget session, to pass labor reforms. And then after Tehelka, it was a boom. And then things got derailed further later in the year because Congress wanted to pull down BJP. And then there was Agra summit, there was 9/11, there was parliament attack, there was Gujarat riots, and things went downhill. After that, the momentum was completely lost, and he could not pass labor reforms. Why I mention labor reforms is that many critics, many economists, they blame Vajpayee for not passing the labor reforms. I mean, maybe he could have managed it better, but I do not see how he can pass labor reform if everyone else is opposing. If his party is opposing, if his allies are opposing, his Congress is opposing. Because in the end, passing labor reforms was also a matter of, you had to have a majority in both the houses. In Lok Sabha, he would issue the whip, and even BJP MPs who did not agree, they would reluctantly come and vote for it. But in Rajya Sabha, they couldn't. So yeah, it was a mixed bag. He tried really hard. And like, for example, in disinvestment, sometimes he also staked his own prestige. Like everybody was opposing Maruti's passing on of Maruti's management to Suzuki. And even Vajpayee would tell in private, it's a bawal ho jayega, because, it was a household name. Maruti Suzuki was a household name. And they were all saying it's anti-labor because obviously disinvestment always, at least in the short run, disinvestment does bring some pain, because, restructuring means that, some factories will be shut before they open the new ones, and there would be a temporary pain. But, organized, nobody wanted that pain. It was easy to, just let things go the way they are. In fact, for many politicians, PSUs are milk cows. So nobody had an incentive. So, reforming, economic reforms have always been a very lonely battle. And during Narasimha Rao, it was mostly file work. But during Vajpayee's time, it was a very emotional thing, a very sentimental thing. Factories were being shut, people were being laid off, thousands of people were being laid off. So they will obviously protest. So it was a very tough battle. And yeah, I mean, you are right. It deteriorated his relationship with many people in Sangh Parivaar, especially Dattopant Thengri, who headed the BMS and the Swadeshi Jagran Manch. They had been old friends. They had traveled together since 1940s, late 1940s. And in old days, they fought very bitterly.
Thanks, Abhishek. We have two more questions, but I thought I'll just remind everyone, if you have any questions, please free to type them out, share it with us, and we'll be taking another 15-20 minutes before we end. Is that okay, Abhishek? Another 15-20 minutes? Okay. And the reason why I'm asking you to pose your questions is because I believe this is the first time you're actually talking about your book in a public
Yes.
So in public space. So
very secretive, and I was also I'm still very nervous about talking about my book, because it's very
so at least.
Yes, it's very difficult to condense 700 pages into neat answers that was he a reformer or not, because his stance kept changing. He was a master vacillator. He kept vacillating all through his life. So
okay. No, I guess what biographies do is, good biographies do is capture nuance. I mean, so, and nuance is something, which we have less and less time for, it's either one thing or the other. And Vajpayee, like every other good politician, I think, is somebody, you have to see him with a in a very nuanced way. The changes that are there, the public and the private, and so on and so forth. But I'm happy that we are very happy here at the International Center Goa that this is the first public presentation of your research and your book. And so let me go to the next question. And one is on the nuclear tests. But before that, I wanted to actually get into the famous 2004 elections, India Shining, right? We have different accounts of what happened, how it happened. And you as a historian have focused on, trying to understand what happened through archival material. Now, archives, of course, we know that they may or may not give you the complete story. There are things which are never going to be recorded the way they should be. And they give you another perspective, a more accurate one in some ways. But so what went wrong in 2004? And I'm sure I told you that the International Center Goa is connected to that, because after the after the defeat, the BJP leadership was in Goa, and in fact, they stayed at the International Center Goa. I mean, this is something I was told, and so the meeting that was, just to understand the shocking loss, because I think all the opinion polls, everything pointed to a BJP victory, and then the reverse happened. So, could you tell us, tell us something about how you have understood, based on your research, the BJP's defeat in 2004? And that seems such a long time ago.
Right, it does. Right. Well, in 2004, basically, BJP lost support among most communities. Now, inside Sangh Parivaar, there were two theories. Mr. Vajpayee believed that the loss resulted due to the loss of Muslim votes. So did most people in the media, so did liberals. On the other hand, the other side, Mr. Advani and many other people in Sangh Parivaar believed the opposite. They thought it was governments turning its back on Hindutva issues, the emotive issues that led, its traditional constituency to vote for some other party. I mean, never before had Brahmins in UP voted for the BSP. So why would a party that was, voting at BJP suddenly start voting Mayawati? I think neither explanation is wrong. They are both accurate, because if you look at the data, the fact is that NDA lost support among most communities. The Muslim vote, and basically Vajpayee had basically calculated that if BJP won 30 seats in UP, he would be able to pull off a government. But they won only 11. So I tried to narrow down and understand what went wrong in UP. In UP, when I looked at the data, I saw that BJP support went down across communities. So, for example, in 1999, 11% Muslims had voted BJP all across UP. In 2004, only 3% did. But at the same time, equally crucial is the fact that BJP's support among upper caste also came down. Like earlier in 99, 68% Brahmins had voted. This time only 60% voted. So there was an 8% decline there too. Among Rajputs, again, dropped from 62 to 50. Among Yadavs, dropped from 8 to 4. So there was an all-round decline. Now, so basically, for whatever reasons, Mr. Vajpayee had on earlier occasions been able to mean everything to everyone. On this occasion, he failed on all counts. Like nobody was willing to trust him, it seems. So that happened. And I don't think the fall in Muslim votes was disproportionate to fall in the votes of other communities. So I think their all-round share went down. Everyone, all castes, across castes and communities, their support came down, basically. Also, there's another theory, like Rupa Subramania and Vivek Dahejia. Again, I have not examined this in detail, but I find this very provocative and very interesting theory, which I am mentioning it. They said that it was 2004 election was a case of being fooled by randomness. And I partly agree with that, because if you look at the data, you would see the aggregate data of which party got how many votes. BJP got 33.3% votes, whereas Congress got 35% votes. Now that's too low a margin of error. By that, I mean that if you conducted an election 10 days later, it is possible that BJP would get 35% and Congress would get 33%. So it was a very tight election. It's almost like tossing a coin. It's like if it's heads, Congress wins. If it's tail, BJP wins. So that is also a theory. It was a very tight election. Having said that, at most places, my personal theory is that NDA lost support across castes and communities everywhere. And that's why they lost.
We have a question from Mr. Subramanian, and he says that he has heard from a friend that Advani and Vajpayee, the personal closeness came partly from the jail time they spent together. Is that true, or is it just some story that Mr. Subramanian has heard, that they got to spend a lot of time in jail together?
Who? Can you please?
Vajpayee and Advani.
Well, no, I mean, they did not spend much time in the jail, actually. I mean, they had known each other since the 50s. And Advani idolized Vajpayee since the 50s. Vajpayee was not in jail for very long. Vajpayee was in Bangalore only for
That's what I was thinking. I mean, that's what I was thinking. I don't think they spent a lot of time in jail, jail together. Yeah. Okay.
They spent a lot of time in the 50s. They lived together. They lived in the same house. And Mr.
Okay.
Vajpayee would cook, and someone else would do the dishes. So yeah, they got close in the 50s.
Were you able to find out if one of them cooked or both of them cooked? Yeah, that would be a very, very interesting thing to know.
Vajpayee
And
likes to
also,
cook occasionally. Yeah, yeah.
okay, we have a question uh, which is on after 2002 Gujarat, what really happened? I mean, Mr. Vajpayee went to Gujarat, and there are different stories about what happened. What did you find out about 2002 Gujarat, and how Mr. Vajpayee approached the problem at hand? I mean, you mentioned that he was somebody who could get things done, mend fences, etc. What happened in 2002, and how
Well,
did it shape his relationship with the current prime minister?
Gujarat riots were complex in the sense that it was, I think, engineered by the Hindu groups across. It was not just BJP. It was also the VHP cadres, and I'm not sure if all of them would have even listened to had Modi tried to control them. It is possible that he may have become unpopular and among his own cadre. That said, Vajpayee thought that Modi had become a political liability, and he wanted to sack Modi for sure. But everybody else made it a prestige issue, and if you remember, Gujarat was at that point. So basically, what BJP had been losing elections state in state after state since '98. They had not won any major election. Gujarat was the only major state at that point they held, and they thought, most people in BJP and Sangh Parivaar thought that Modi is popular, and if we sack him, it will be unfair, and if we replace him, it will lead to more confusion and chaos, and in all probability, we'll lose Gujarat too. So that was and Mr. Vajpayee, yeah, he tried very hard, but at some point, I think he was basically told that this can't be done. People put their foot down. In fact, if anything, there were rumors, and I mean, privately, he was being asked to resign from many quarters. So I would say indirectly, he had a choice of resigning himself or sacking Modi. So yeah, I mean, he thought it was.
Incidentally, this question was asked by an anonymous attendee, and I wish, I mean, it's a good thing if people say who they are, and when they ask a question. Okay, last question, unless we have more questions from those who are listening in, which is on India's nuclear tests. Is it fair to say, or is it correct to say that it took the decisive leadership. It took decisive leadership on the part of the BJP and Mr. Vajpayee to go ahead with the nuclear tests? I mean, that is one something which is thrown at us, that the Congress could not, or parties which had come to power earlier on could not. India had nuclear capability and so on and so forth. But what went into the making of India's nuclear tests? The reason I'm asking is not because this is a question which has been asked again and again by scholars in international relations. But at least for the second half of Vajpayee's career in politics, I mean, this is something which stands out, other than economic reforms or 1992 or Rath Yatra and so on. Even the relationship with the BJP, with Mr. Advani and so on and so forth. Whether he was a radical or a moderate or something in between. So what went into the making of India's nuclear tests in 1998? Why under Vajpayee? Why at that time? What can you tell us based on your book?
Well, was it a necessity conducting tests in May 98? Yes and no. No, because there was no urgent threat, security threat. Also because, it is a morally dubious decision. You do not cure a disease by spreading its symptoms. But at the same time, you have to see like a state, and which is that, nation states are guided almost entirely by self-interest. They're not guided by morality. Now, what was happening around that time had to do more with city-biti than anything else. Now, India's biggest security threat, China, China was one of the P5 members. And even on the eve of signing the CTBT, China signed it, they did not ratify it. Even on the eve of signing the CTBT, China was conducting nuclear tests. And in fact, it's public knowledge that China was also helping Pakistan acquire nuclear weapons. So for Indians, I think it was a sign of the P5's opportunism and moral hypocrisy for sure. And I think, and there was a clause in CTBT which kind of made it compulsory on all nuclear capable states to join it, which basically meant that India could no longer, it had only two choices. It could no longer be ambiguous forever. It had only two choices. It could test and then sign CTBT, or it could sign CTBT without conducting a test. And I think at that point of time, Mr. Vajpayee calculated that it was much safer testing and then signing CTBT. I mean, that he did not sign is another story, is a longer story in itself. And I think had it been any other government, they would have done exactly the same. Had it been Mrs. Gandhi, had it been Rajiv Gandhi, any Congress government would have done the same. In fact, if Devagowda also had a stable government, even he might have tested. So testing was totally no-brainer. And of course, with BJP was the only party that had mentioned testing even in its manifesto. The NDA had a document called NAG, that's National Agenda for Governance. So it was an open secret that they were going to do it. It was just a matter of timing. And Mr. Vajpayee thought that the sooner they got done with it, the better it would be, because he wanted to move ahead with reforms, and he knew that this would be he wanted to get done with nuclear tests, bear the pain, bear the economic sanctions, then butter up US and then get along. So he just wanted to get done at the beginning of his term for all these reasons, and because CTBT's closure was also coming to an end. Every country had to sign it by October 99. So there was not much time. So he thought, why not just get done with it and then move on with life. So that was the reason he did it immediately.
Thanks, Abhishek. We have another question, but again from an anonymous attendee, and I'm not going to ask that question. I'll just say that the book includes, has a section on Mr. Vajpayee's, or covers his private life as well. But I'm not comfortable with repeatedly posing questions on behalf of anonymous attendees. I think it's inappropriate. Whereas I can at least see everybody's name. Anybody who asks that question, please feel free to do so. But and then just to answer your question, that yes, the book, Abhishek's book, covers Vajpayee's personal life as well. It's not as if it's limited to his political career. Anyway, so we are nearing the end of 1 hour, and unless there are any quick questions, this is the time we'll end. And no. So we'll just give it a minute if somebody else has questions. So Abhishek, meanwhile, what next? After you are done with this, and you have lived with this book for 5 years, I mean, it's something you want to be done with, right? I mean,
yes, I'm quite desperate to be done with it, but in all likelihood, I will remain enslaved, colonized by this project for, it seems to me, at least next 8-9 months. I do have many tentative ideas, but then it's a question of resources. So yeah, I don't want to talk about them exactly, but I do have many ideas for a second book.
A quick minute on the title of the book. I quite liked it, Believer's Dilemma, but what exactly do you want to convey with that title?
That Mr. Vajpayee had some genuine dilemmas. Like he was a deeply, so okay. He had some genuine dilemmas, and on some occasions he also did some deliberate double speaking. But some of his dilemmas were very real. Like he thought he could, if he had his way, he thought he could make Hindutva a mainstream conservative party that you have in the US, or like the Tories are in the UK. And it's an open question whether or not BJP ended up becoming that party, because so in that sense, I mean, I thought it was a safe title. I'm still open to a new title, but as I was telling you the other day, I thought it was the least worst title that I could think of for the moment.
I thought it was a great title. I thought it's not great, if not good enough. And I think it sort of conveys in some ways what what most of us, who have read a little bit about Vajpayee or lived through that period.
And also partly because he also thought, Vajpayee genuinely believed that Hindutva was the only real model of democracy, only real model of secularism. He genuinely believed. He did not think he genuinely believed that Hindutva need not be violent. But then he's been proved wrong on so many occasions. So, and partly because my book is about the parallel lives of Sangh Parivaar and Vajpayee. So that's why I thought Believer's Dilemma would be an appropriate title.
Okay.
I don't know if
but you are still open to titles. So, if anyone has an idea, even though you haven't read the book, so anyone listening in, you have any great ideas about title of the book, Abhishek will be happy to hear from you. Right? Okay. Thank you so much, Abhishek. There is there is one more. This is a question from Mr. Khwaja Sultan, and this will be the last question. How open was Mr. Vajpayee to criticism, say in comparison to politicians of the more recent generation? Was he open to criticism, or
very open, very open? He had a sense of humor, and he was very open to criticism.
And I got a sense he was always, like any good politician, he was able to deflect criticism with a joke, with a smile, with some other anecdote, or
Yes.
mislead.
One of the great examples is every time he was asked a question on his private life, he deflected it in such a shrewd manner. Like if somebody asked me about my complicated private life, I might feel offended. But he never felt offended. I remember people can Google it on YouTube. I mean, I have many other stories on my book, which I don't want to reveal right now. But there's an interview in which someone asked him, "Ki aapke kabhi affair bhi nahi hue?" And then he smiles and says, "Affairs ki charta public spaces mein nahi ki jati hai." And so he's not saying that he did not have an affair. And so that was Mr. Vajpayee. He did not get angry with such questions.
Okay, that's very interesting, because I always thought that good politicians should be able to handle criticism with, by telling another story or going off in a completely different direction, or coming up with a joke or two, and not be overly. I mean, you are in a job where criticism is just going to happen all the time. Anyway, so thank you, Abhishek, very much, and we are very hopeful that you'll finish the book and hand it off. Get rid of it. Almost.
My pleasure. And it's been, despite some hiccups, despite COVID and despite the brain fog that it followed, it's been I totally enjoyed my stay at ICZ, and I would love to come here again. So yeah, thank you so much for that opportunity.
And I'll also take this time to make a quick announcement that in the next 30-45 days, the International Center Goa will be advertising for the next round of Scholars in Residence Awards. These awards come with 1 month's stay at the International Center, a stipend and air travel from wherever you are. And, it's open to everyone, but those of you who are at a more advanced stage of writing, they'll be preferred, but we are completely open to different book projects, except that you should not be, just submitting a book proposal. What we want to look at is, what is the kind of work you have already done? At least some of it should be done, so that we can feel confident that, you'll be writing the book. And in this case, in Abhishek's case, this is his first book. We actually selected 2 scholars in residence. Abhishek is the first one, and I'm happy to tell everyone that the second person we selected, Amrita Shah, she's already at the International Center Goa. She'll be spending a month. We'll be having a webinar with her, about her book, which is again in progress, sort of nearing completion in the next few months, in the next many months maybe. So the whole idea is that you apply for a Scholars in Residence award when you have completed some work on your book, spread the word around, and pass it on to aspiring writers, experienced writers. So in Abhishek's case, this is his first book. In Amrita's case, this will be her fourth book, I think. So we are open to giving it to both people with writing their first book or more experienced writers. And this will be advertised on ICG's website. If you're on our mailing list, you'll get that. And we'll also likely advertise in the Economic and Political Weekly, the web edition, so that we are able to reach more people. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you once again, Abhishek, for this fantastic 1 hour that you spent with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.